we are back now with the new series of the lunchtime research seminars. And our first one, we are very, very delighted and to have with us today Zainab Mai Bornu, who will tell us a little bit about her book entitled Political Violence and Oil in Africa, the Case of Nigeria. I'm not going to introduce her or anything, so I will let Zainab introduce herself to us, and they take us in the journey, to know a little bit about her book. Over to you, Zainab.
Thank you very much, Masood. So my name is Zainab. I work at CTPSR, and today I'm happy to present my book, Political Violence and Oil in Africa, the Case of Nigeria. So generally, there is a common tendency among people in Nigeria when oil-producing communities in the Niger Delta, agitate and protest over resource control and self-determination. Mostly, they regard their actions as unjustified noise-making. Media reports share the same tendency. They are frequently biased and focus more on how these protest actions affect the economy of the country than on the problems which plague the region. The people of the Niger Delta feel ignored and misunderstood, sensing that in most cases their grievances are not perceived as genuine and legitimate because of the majority of Nigerians do not have the knowledge and understanding of what is actually happening in the region. As an outsider, I decided to embark upon an investigative journey in the region to find out about the issues myself, and most importantly, to try and understand why the people in that region react the way they do. What followed was an academic adventure into an unknown territory, often described as dangerous and unfriendly, especially to the Hausa, which is my own ethnic group, the Yoruba and Igbo. The journey made me realize how lucky I was to live in a clean environment, free of gas flaring and oil pollution, to have safe drink and clean drinking water, to be able to move about freely without pipelines crisscrossing my backyard. It brought home to me the enormity of the challenges faced in the Niger Delta. But most importantly, to me, it is not enough to judge and assess or even condemn the situation from a distance. Rather, it requires the in-depth exploration and understanding of the issues facing the region. What I found out in the Niger Delta was a shocking landscape of pipelines, gas flares, oil spills, devastated land, polluted water. It made me more determined to carry out a thorough exploration of the issues facing the Delta. So this research, and the research in the Delta led to a PhD thesis at the University of Bath, and the PhD thesis led to this book. I argue that in order to best understand the undercurrents of the Niger Delta conflict and the distinct courses of action chosen by the two groups, the Ogoni and the Ijaw in the Niger Delta, it is important to analyze the dynamics of choice. In other words, given the similar structural constraints that they face, we need to consider why the Ogoni adopted nonviolent resistance and the Ijaw violent resistance. This book is divided into 7 chapters. This is the book. Chapter 1 provides an introduction to oil and political violence in African conflicts. It discusses the methodology and scope of the study and presents a synoptic overview of 4 other research-rich countries in Africa facing issues like Nigeria, including Congo, Sudan, South Sudan, and 2 others. Chapter 2 focuses on the theoretical and conceptual underpinnings of conflict with the aim of situating the Niger Delta conflict within the wider conflict literature. It sets out the conceptual understandings of the dynamics of nonviolence and violence in conflicts that includes social movements, contention, structure and agency, and the construction of collective narratives. Chapter 3 concentrates the discussion on the Nigerian Niger Delta. It outlines the environmental, socio-economic, and political issues at the center of the contestations and sets the backdrop of the strategic choices of violence and non-violence in the Niger Delta conflicts. in addition to arguing why a different focus on the conflicts is important. The following three chapters, chapters 4, 5, and 6, offer an in-depth analysis on the dynamics of choice used in charting the causes of the two movements, that's the Ogoni and the Ijaw. Chapter 4 looks at how the narratives of the Ogoni led to non-violence and those of the Ijaw, which initially started within the context of non-violence also, but later changed to violence. Chapter 5 illustrates how the Ogoni leaders preached non-violence and the Ijaw preached violence. It analyzed also the strategies adopted by the different leaders. Chapter 6 looks at how the Ogoni developed an organizational structure for advocacy, negotiations, and peaceful links with international bodies such as the United Nations, while the Ijaw developed an organization primarily suited for armed struggle. It also analyzes the development and presentation of the Ogoni Bill of Rights. It compares it with the Ijaw Kyama Declaration, which is also another articulated set of requests by the Ijaw youth. Finally, Chapter 7 draws threads from all the previous chapters into a conclusion, presenting an overview of the findings and contributions of this book, together with recommendations for future research. So going back to the book, the key debates regarding the issues in the Niger Delta, some have economic explanations. There's the issue of greed versus grievance as proposed by Paul Collier and others, and also the issue of horizontal inequalities in terms of the issues facing the region. There is also marginalization and political exclusion, neglect and political marginalization, especially with regards to their rights and also with regards to the environment. So one question I kept asking myself is this: is the environment a source of conflict? This is a region rich in oil and gas resources. So I kept asking, does an abundance of natural resources lead to violent conflict while others choose non-violence? Does also a scarcity of natural resources or perhaps a degradation of environmental resources lead to conflict? And if this is true, what are the mechanisms? So issues about the Niger Delta revolve around the occurrence of oil and the presence of multinational oil companies such as Shell, Total, ExxonMobil, and the others. But the major player, the key player in the Niger Delta in Nigeria is Shell. There's the issue of exploitation, like I spoke about. Scholars such as Watts and Ibaba, Ikelegbe, Nwajiaku, so many of them have written about the issues of the Niger Delta. But most importantly are the huge levels of environmental issues faced in the region, deprivation exacerbated by continuous ecological damage. The various groups in the Delta, especially the Ogoni and Ijaw, are demanding for justice and equal distribution, that's a fair share of revenues, as well as a right to self-determination and resource control in the region. The reality is, going to the Niger Delta, which I have gone and have seen for myself, the water sources are polluted due to oil spills and leakages from old pipes. Some of the communities I visited had no clean drinking water, not even to cook. The environment, the lands are polluted. You see where there are oil spills, so they can't even farm, and even the rivers are polluted. So fishing is a problem. Poverty is also another problem. With gas flaring almost 24 hours a day in some places, some of these areas have 24 hours daylight. They breathe in contaminated air, leading to serious health issues. And I can say that the region is one of the highest in terms of cancer, skin cancer, for example. So I came across, a research puzzle in terms of, here we have two ethnic groups, the Ogoni and the Ijaw, who live in the same conditions, facing similar structural issues, and yet made different trajectories and choices in expressing their grievances. So my main research question is, why did the Ogoni adopt non-violence as a means of expressing their grievances while the Ijaw opted for a violent course of action? So to answer this question, I decided to look at the collective narrative developed by the leaders of the two different groups, the Ogoni and the Ijaw. It is, well, in the Niger Delta, there are so many other ethnic groups, but the prominent ones are the Ogoni and the Ijaw, those that voiced out, their issues and their concerns over the exploitation and damage to the land, for example. The others also have done something, but they are not really as loud and as vocal as the Ogoni and Ijaw. So I decided also to look at the strategic choices and different courses of action taken by the leaders to express their group's grievances and frustrations against the Nigerian state and the reasons behind those choices. I also looked at the outcomes that led to the transition from a non-violent protest led by the late Ken Saro-Wiwa on the Ogoni side to a violent situation in the case of the Ijaw. So the analysis, like I mentioned, were based on 3 sub-points: narratives on nonviolence versus violence, nature and goals of the leaderships, and the organizational structure of the Ogoni and Ijaw movements. Due to the complexity of the dynamics of choice, I had to rely on a method that permitted for a broad approach, which to me is suitable for identifying critical mechanisms and variables of interest that would explain why one group adopted nonviolence and the other adopted violence. So I used qualitative research methods. I relied heavily on elite interviews with key informants and actors in the two movements. So when I say key informants, I interviewed from the Ogoni and the Ijaw side, some of the key people that acted, the key leaders and participants of the two movements, the Ogoni side and also the Ijaw side. I also engaged with some of the civil society organizations and some government sources. I tried my best to reach out to the oil companies, but to date, I'm still waiting to be granted an interview by Shell and also the LNG. I was asked at one time to fill out so many legal documents, which I did, but still no response from them. So some of my findings in terms of the Ogoni, in terms of the narratives, were based on the construction of Ogoni as a distinct nation from the 1990s with exceptional links to the land. To the Ogoni, the land is very precious. So anything that affects the land is a taboo to the Ogoni. They look at it as going against their norms, their culture and values. But the nature of the Nigerian state, according to the Ogoni leaders, they still look at the Nigerian state as a colonial state. They look at it as a state that is coming to extract, not to really, build, as they said. They tried humanizing the enemy, which to them, as they claim, is the state, through civil protests, letter writing, and activities and campaigns. They spoke about internal colonialism. So they feel they are being colonized internally by the Nigerian state, and they also said by the Igbo ethnic group. To them, they focus on the issue of transnationalism and internationalism, pressing minority rights. I also found very positive collective agency within the Ogoni, although they have their internal issues, but the discourses and international solidarity and peaceful encounter with the state is one norm that the Ogoni are still talking about. And I also observed the strong linkage to internationally accepted norm of nonviolence. They had strong links with the UN, Greenpeace, Body Shop. One of the interviewees said to me, for the Ogoni to engage the state and get international support, they had to make sure that they focus on the use of non-violence. To them, engaging in violence would be futile because, one, they are small in number and they don't have the might, the resources to fight the Nigerian state. So they decided to focus on non-violence, getting the legitimacy internationally. So in terms of leadership on the Ogoni side, I found a disciplined and intellectual leadership going back to the 1940s with the Ogoni, the father of the Ogoni, Paul Birabi. And then after Paul Birabi, who focused on a lot about, building the Ogoni intellectually in terms of education, among other things, and other developmental projects. Nothing really happened after Paul Birabi until Ken Saro-Wiwa came up in the 1990s and decided to take on the struggle on behalf of the Ogoni people. So to Birabi, the importance of education and enlightenment of the Ogoni was very important. And this is something that Ken Saro-Wiwa also took over, but he decided to focus on the use of non-violence. He also focused on ethnic autonomy, resource and environmental control, something, a term he called erectism, because he felt it was up to the Ogoni to stand up and fight for what they felt was right, to even control, what happens to their environment and also the resources taken from them. Another finding has to do with the social status of the Ogoni leadership. They provided a well-informed platform to engage with a collective sense of agency. I also observed high leadership capital and non-violence is continuously advocated. I must also point out that I'm not saying that, maybe using non-violence, the fact that you use non-violence makes you, a peaceful person. No, what I'm trying to say here is that some of the strategies adopted in comparison to the Ogoni is quite different from the Ogoni, from the Ijaw, because to them, they focused on a collective platform, working together as a group rather than maybe just different individuals fighting for the cause of the Ogoni. In terms of the organization of the Ogoni movement, Ken Saro-Wiwa led the presentation of an Ogoni Bill of Rights, which articulated all the problems faced by the Ogoni right from independence. I think some of the issues date back to pre-independence, but focusing more in terms of from independence, all what they have gone through and they have experienced. They also, as part of the Ogoni Bill of Rights, Ken Saro-Wiwa led to the establishment of MOSOP, that's the Movement for the Survival of the Ogoni People, an umbrella organization of 10 affiliated bodies, including women groups, students in the university, secondary school, faith-based leaders, intellectual leaders, among others. MOSOP is one of such bodies, under the Movement of the Survival of the Ogoni People. MOSOP, that is the youth arm of the Ogoni people, was established to push forward the Ogoni agenda in terms of making representations to the UN and the international community. And still, in terms of my analysis, there's the insistence on non-violence. Even though Ken Saro-Wiwa is no more, there are divisions within the Ogoni, they still talk about non-violence. As one of the people I interviewed said, our leader taught us how to fight, but using a pen rather than taking up a sword. So looking now at the Ijaw, which is the other group that I used in comparison to the Ogoni, I also found out that it is a collective one ethnic group, and it is in fact the fourth largest ethnic group in Nigeria after the Hausa, the Yoruba, and the Igbo. They also regard the state as being colonial, aggressive, and confrontational. They look at their anger is against the three major ethnic groups that control the Nigerian government, as they claim, that's the Hausa, the Yoruba, and the Igbo in Nigeria. They do stress Ijaw minority status being the fourth, but they don't talk about internal colonialism in comparison to the Ogoni. But some of the interviews, that I got, my analysis also, they do talk about, they do engage with the form of internal colonialism, which is internal, being dominated internally, but this is more specific to the Hausa, Yoruba, and the Igbo, but they don't really talk about, use the term internal colonialism. There is no impactful internationalization record in comparison to the Ogoni who engaged with the UN and the Greenpeace and other international organizations. It was in discussions were not done on a collective platform, but based on individual basis, people like Oronto Douglas, the late Oronto Douglas, who engaged with some international communities. He was, some of his discussions also brought the Italian parliament to the Niger Delta to see for themselves, and they were able to discuss on behalf of the Ogoni, the Ijaw people. Most importantly, after maybe after the death of Ken Saro-Wiwa, on the Ijaw side, I also found the connection to the discourse on violence as against non-violence, because the Ijaw claim if Ken Saro-Wiwa of the Ogoni, the champion of non-violence, was executed by the Nigerian state, so why now do we wait for the Nigerian state to come and kill us? Rather, we should engage the state using force. So in terms of the leadership, on the Ijaw side, the leadership I found was not as coordinated and unified as the Ogoni. I came across two distinct types of leadership that was fluid and fractured. On one side, I found the nonviolent intellectual leaders that led to the development of the Kyama Declaration, people like Isaac Oswaka, T.K. Ogoriba, Patterson Ogoni, and the others. Then I came across the radical militants. For example, going back to the 1960s, the Isaac Adakaboro, which one person that the Ogoni look at, the Ijaw look at as their leader. So sometimes some of the violent agitations, they always pay allegiance to the Adakaboro revolution. I came across also people like Asari Dokubo, Ateke Tom, Boilo, Tompolo, some of the militant leaders. These are people that felt it upon themselves to take the struggle because they were closer to the grassroots level, and they felt it was up to them to protect their communities, most especially people like Tompolo. I also observed the lack of leadership capital as seen in the Ogoni movement, because the Ogoni, they still have their Mosop as the vocal arm of the Ogoni movement. The Mosop president is still talking on behalf of the Ogoni, while on the Ijaw side is not like that. Rather, there are different sets of leaders. We have the intellectual ones, and we still have the vocal, ones, those that took up arms, but later gave up their arms and accepted the amnesty. And in terms of the social status, the radicals, I think, claim that the Nigerian state denied them agency. So since that agency was denied to the Ijaw, they felt it upon themselves, to take up arms. And then some of them, I came across those closer to the grassroots level were not really as highly as educated, as those on the Ogoni side. But the intellectual groups like Isaac Oswaka were people that were highly educated to the university level, some even to postgraduate level. And these were people during their universities that engaged in a lot of students' union activism. So one major important finding in the later stage of the Ogoni movement is the one option of response in terms of engaging in violence against the state. The Ogoni organization of the movement, going back to the Kyama Declaration in 1998, this was like a peaceful resistance which mirrored the Ogoni Bill of Rights. They also had the Ijaw Youth Council. They still have the Ijaw National Council also. But after the death of Ken Saro-Wiwa, we saw the advent of highly militant groups such as MEND, Movement for the Emancipation of the Niger Delta, This transformed into a grouping of diverse militant youth groups with perpetually fluid associations and allegiances. Most of these militant groups were organized in military style camps, with Tompolo's Camp 5 being the most recognized. Here, to me, this was a clear indication of the violent option as against non-violence in the Ogoni side. So I faced a lot of challenges earlier, being an outsider. Initially, access to people in that region was a problem for me, but sometimes it helps being a Nigerian and being that I did a lot of work in the public sector. So I decided to reach out to some of my contacts and I explained my predicament, and I was introduced to three leaders in the Niger Delta. And, you know, being that they accepted me, so I got their trust and they introduced me to the different groups I wanted to engage with. And but one important thing I have to say is that when engaging with the militants, those that took up arms, I had to paraphrase my research theme from non-violence and violence to talk about more, I referred to them as freedom fighters, which is what I was told. And then I just decided to talk about strategies in expressing grievances. And by doing that, they accepted and I had, you know, a very good engagement. And I'm happy to say I'm still in contact with them, because in research, you never forget, you know, those that opened up access to you. So it's good to continue, you know, engaging with them occasionally. So I eliminated the use of violent militants, like I said, to freedom fighters and ex-agitators when working with the warlords. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take your questions.
Right, thank you very much, Zainab. I think I've got questions, but I think I'm going to open the floor for the audience. If anyone has got any questions, please.
Zainab, thanks so much for that fascinating account of your research. Very interesting indeed. So I just wanted to ask you a bit more about this dichotomy between violence and non-violence, the Ijaw and the Ogoni, and whether you explored whether this dichotomy is actually as clear and distinct as presented. I mean, is there any blurring around the edges? For example, were there different factions, sort of pro or anti-arms struggle within both groups, or did the emphasis on violence or non-violence shift over time? I was thinking in particular of the Ogoni, you know, the execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa and his colleagues, I think, what, 95, 96, you know, when they were so atrociously hanged. Did that lead to a shift in strategy and you know, the more voices within the Ogoni clamoring for an alternative to non-violence? Thank you.
Okay. So to me, the distinctions are clear, because going back to the Ogoni, Ken Saro-Wiwa and the others executed were framed. They were accused of murdering 4 Ogoni, you know, the Ogoni, for the 4 Ogoni leaders that were murdered during a rally that Ken Saro-Wiwa was supposed to attend. There was this trial that took place, which the Ogoni call a kangaroo trial, where Ken Saro-Wiwa and the others were not given a free trial. So that murder, I think, marked a major distinction between some of the Ogoni communities, because there are those that felt that Ken Saro-Wiwa, you know, Ken Saro-Wiwa was like taking too much power and control of the Ogoni group, because some of them wanted to engage in politics, but there was a time Mossop, as as the spokes arm of the Ogoni people, decided to boycott. There was an order for all the Ogoni to boycott the elections at that time. Some of the Ogoni leaders were not really favorably disposed to this. They felt they wanted to engage. It was an opportunity for them, to get some benefits from the Nigerian state. But Mossop insisted no. So this led to a lot of fraction, and then the killing of the Ogoni 4 came, and then Ken Saro-Wiwa was executed. So like I said, there are still issues within the Ogoni, even the Ogoni Mossop. Even now, there are, we have one, Legosi Piagbara, who is the recognized Mossop president, but there are two other people laying claims as being, Mossop president. So there are fractions. Well, one important observation is in all their discussions and interactions, they still talk about nonviolence. They always say, some of the meetings I have attended on the Ogoni leadership side, they emphasize, the issue of nonviolence and engaging the state using civil forms of action. But going back to the Ijaw, initially when the Kyama Declaration came about, it was an order for all the oil companies just to leave Ijaw land, to stop oil exploration and everything. So at that time, there was this group, intellectual leaders, that were trying to mirror, the Ogoni struggle, and hopefully they were trying to get also legitimacy internationally, so that they could get support of maybe some international organizations in fighting their cause. But after the the execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa, those at the grassroots level, people like Asari Dokubo, who was also one of the, I think he was the vice president of the Ijaw Youth Council at that time, they felt it was an insult on the people in the Niger Delta, because here they had the Ogoni trying to engage with the state, with the Nigerian government through peaceful means, but they were not given a fair trial. They were not even given a voice, So why should they wait for the state to come and kill them? And some of the interviewees said to me, we felt the only option for us was to match fire for fire using the Nigerian language. They said there was no point. So instead of waiting for them, let's go to them, So, and while in the Delta, whenever I go to the Niger Delta, I'm always invited to one youth meeting or another. One major observation, there is always a call to arms. There is always a call to action on the Ijaw side. And like I said, an amnesty was granted. Even after the amnesty, we saw some relative peace in the region. But you always hear of 1 or 2 new crops of militant groups coming up. So I think the distinction is clear.
Okay, thank you, Zainab. I think the next question is from Jessica.
Thank you so much. Thanks for this powerful presentation, and I'm looking forward to reading the book, Zainab. I wanted to ask you 2 questions, if possible. Firstly, you talked about internal colonialism, that the groups, in the different ways they might have expressed it in terms of internal colonialism. Did they also express this in terms of neo-colonialism? To what extent was the anger directed against the oil companies? Because you talked about the Nigerian government. How did they frame that, and were there differences between the groups? And I'm just horrified that Shell wouldn't even answer you or meet with you, even discuss anything, when they seem to be, the key drivers within the conflict. And the second question was, what was the role that women played? I know you've done research into the effects on women of this conflict and the devastation, but were they as active within these groups, within the movements? That would be really interesting to know a bit more. Thanks again.
Okay. To start with the women played a key role, a very important role, especially in the Ogoni movement. They were the backbone of Ken Saro-Wiwa's protest. At the forefront, always they had the women. The women sometimes would even demonstrate naked. They would tie leaves, on their bodies, and they would, when it comes to, they would sometimes go to some of these oil companies, and then they will sit in front, because the belief is that if you have the women in front, it will signify non-violence, because the belief is that women don't carry arms against the state. So they played a very big role. And his mother, based on the interview I had with Owens, we were his brother, he said to me, their mother, Jessica, opened up access for Ken to all the different women groups in Ogoni land. Remember, I spoke about MOSOP having 10 affiliated bodies. So there's the Federation of Ogoni Women's Association, which is still a very powerful force in Ogoni land. So whenever even the MOSOP elections are coming up, the women play a very big role. And even in terms of, advocating non-violence, especially, the women said to me in my latest research, that being a mother, a wife, a sister, you had that power to preach to your husband, maybe to your brother, to your son, and maybe your nephews in terms of non-violence. Then going back to internal colonialism, they didn't really talk about neo-colonialism. It was mainly internally, because they felt they were being, Nigeria was colonized by the British, but now that the British have gone back, still the Ogoni being a minority, they feel they're a minority within a minority, because the Niger Delta is regarded a minority region. So Ogoni being one of the smallest groups in the region, they believe that they are a minority within a minority. So in terms of internal colonialism, in terms of job opportunities, scholarships, among other things, they felt they were just being, they were being dominated by the Igbo, most especially, in addition to the Nigerian state and oil companies. The Ogoni still regard the oil companies negatively, although there are some improvements. Now things are getting better, because there are some discussions in terms of resumption of oil exploration in Ogoni land. During Sariwa's time, the protests were so much so that they forced all the oil companies out of Ogoni land. If you go to Ogoni land, you see abandoned projects. But so they still talk about maybe resumption, but they are strongly against Shell. Maybe if other companies, as they said to me, if another oil company will come and say they're going to come back and explore, we may consider, but anything Shell is frowned against. But then I'm trying to engage Shell with my latest project on the women to see if a dialogue can start between the women and Shell.
Hello, Zainab. Thank you. That's very interesting presentation. And I think my question is about solution in terms of the current, political dynamics in the country. It is a big problem in Nigeria where if you're not familiar with the terrain and the environment in the Niger Delta, it is very difficult to be sympathetic, even if there is some element of violent, confrontation with the government and oil companies. My experience, I think, working in that region and going into the villages, I was shocked. And it's interesting to see that you've captured something similar in terms of the lack of infrastructure, the lack of access to roads and hospitals and the wider environmental degradation. And people don't know. People don't know about that in the rest of the country, given that the region is just 1 out of 6. The political dynamics. Do you see it ever improving in favor of whether violent or non-violent approach? Do you see the political class able to solve this problem or coming together from all parts of the country to solve this problem, to see it as a genuine, humanitarian problem in that region?
This is really interesting. In terms of, solutions, the issue has to do with political will. We have leaders that are not really interested in solving the issues in the Niger Delta. The Niger Delta, the root causes are there. If the state is able to, address environmental issues in the Niger Delta, for example, we will see, positive things happening. But I asked them during my interviews. I even had an interview with the former president, Ibrahim Babangida. And I said to him, why didn't you do anything on the Ogoni Bill of Rights? They asked for an Ogoni state. You created some states after their request. Why weren't they given? And the answer he gave me was that he said at that time, there were a lot of security issues happening in Nigeria. And he said to me, if we decided at that time to just pick on the Ogoni and give them a state, he said we would have been faced with almost every local government in Nigeria asking for a state. But then I said, what about the issues? Environmental issues, for example. They're asking for resource control. Go to the Niger Delta, like you said, Abdullah, I'm happy you've been there. Some of the places you will, being a woman, sometimes you will even, be at the point of tears because you go to a community and you see this river. The river is polluted already. You can see oil, but that is the same river that they fetch water to drink. On one side, you see someone defecating into the same source of water. And this is what these people use, And then I said to them, okay, you have the Ministry of Niger Delta, you have, there's the NDDC, Niger Delta Development Company. In Nigeria, it is only the Niger Delta that had about 4 or 5 major interventions, and it is the only region that has a dedicated ministry, assigned to it. But when you go, you don't see progress. And then I asked them, the Ogoni, the Ijo, and some of even the civil society groups in the Niger Delta. I said, but do you call your people to order? I said, you had President Goodluck Jonathan. Why didn't you bring up the case of the issue of maybe the Kyama Declaration of the Ogoni Bill of Rights during the discussions of the amnesty? Okay, but they said to me, the only leader in Nigeria that had the true interest of the Niger Delta was the late President Umaru Yar'Adua, who was the one that brought the militants to the table. I remember at that time, even in the North, many people were saying, my people, in the North were saying, why should Yar'Adua even engage with, with militants? Blah, 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 blah. It's like he was trying to, favor them. But the issues are genuine. They're real. You need to go there and appreciate what is happening. But you see, the problem is transparency, accountability. And I said to them, so what did you say to Jonathan? Oh, some of them said, we felt this was our man. Our brother was now at the helm of affairs. We decided to lie low and allow him, allow him to make progress. I said, but this is your own person. Why didn't you, insist on addressing some of the issues? Well, to cut the whole story short, the majority of the Niger Deltans are not too happy with President Goodluck Jonathan because he didn't really address the cause. So is that political will? You need to have people that will have the interest of Niger Delta, some of the things happening that will really address, and transparency and accountability. They've had so many interventions, even from international organizations. You go to the Delta, you don't see the development that you're expecting to see. So that is one problem. And the issue of corruption, which is a major problem for us in Nigeria.
If your own question is not urgent, because I have very simple questions to clarify. Yeah, but first I would like to say congratulations to Zainab for your book. And I also find it amazing that as women, you could access to this area with this violence. So I think you are very brave. I can imagine how hard this methodology is. So congratulations on that. And because I'm completely ignorant about the context about African regions, and also I missed some of your presentation, so I'm very sorry. I just want to clarify a few puzzles. One is, so these companies, they are owned by state or they're owned by foreign companies or private companies? That puzzled me. Like when you say two groups engage with these issues, so they are engaging with these companies, or these companies represent states, or so this state company. This relation is confusing. And then second question is also to clarify, when you talk about follow-up from previous question, I concerned about outcomes, because these two groups, they took different approaches, right? So from your observation, did you see any differences in terms of outcomes? Non-violence, does it necessarily lead to any progress? But from your response to previous question, it seems like not much, right? And the third is also very brief, just out of curiosity. So it seems to me you are trying to, your focus is on leadership. You think it must be one of the major issue that leads to like taking different approaches. So any other elements you think are important why these two groups took these different approaches, like in terms of like what's the role of civil societies or this public, or you mentioned in the Ogoni about this cultural ideas, norms, it's about nonviolence. So any other elements, just out of curiosity? Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So in the Delta, we have major players. The Nigerian state is a major player, followed by Shell. And then we have other multinational oil companies. So really, the thing is, we have the Nigerian state and we have the international companies. But when the communities protest, for example, when they go maybe to Shell or to Mobil or Total, you know, the response they get from all these companies is that go and engage with your government. You know, we are paying all our royalties and everything to the Nigerian state, so everything you should go and get from your own government. But I think to a large extent, some of the oil companies, they have these corporate social responsibilities. They're trying, you know, to help maybe get some progress in the region, but honestly, it's not really what is expected, because you go to a camp, maybe Shell camp, you see, you know, they have in the night, you see there's light, there's water and everything, but just go maybe 2, 3, or even 5 kilometers and you see this small community, no light, no water, you know, for example. So the issues are really complex, and these key players, there's always back and forth between the state and the multinational oil companies, among other things. So second question, I think, has to do with strategies, I think you said. Am I right?
Second question is very similar to previous question you answered about outcomes, like when they took different approaches. Okay. So you think nonviolence, they got more, they succeed?
Okay, yes.
No?
Yeah. Yes, I think the strategies, you know, even if you read my book, you see there's a difference. For the Ogoni that charted the nonviolence course, yes, they achieved a lot, really, in you know, international recognition. And the United Nations sent a rapporteur, you know, to go and assess the situation in Ogoni land, and there was a report after that. And based on their nonviolent strategies, there was also the United Nations Environmental Program also sent a team to go and assess the land in Ogoni land. And there's the UNEP report. I'm very happy to share it with all of you. And you'll be shocked to find out, you know, the levels of destruction found, you know, in terms of the environment. And one major positive outcome is that there is this agreement now between UNEP and the Nigerian state to clean up Ogoni land in terms of the environmental damages. So this is something that is yet to take up, you know, fully, maybe 100%. There are still issues, even internal issues within the Ogoni. But I know this is at least a positive development, and other oil producing communities are also looking at it positively. If they see the successful cleanup of Ogoni land, then hopefully they have hope, maybe their own areas will also be cleaned up. And I must say that Shell, at this stage, Shell has committed itself 100%, because they have even put the money down. So it is just they're just waiting, you know, for the progress is on the Nigerian side, the Nigerian state, but hopefully maybe in the next year or two, we'll see real cleanup taking place in Ogoni land. So yes, there are benefits. And then in terms of, you spoke about other strategies that are used, maybe apart from leadership, well, I must say that leadership plays a very big role in the Niger Delta, but one thing I observed is that all these groups, the Ogoni, the Ijo, they have similar issues. They are not working as one, Each group, there are issues, internal issues. And I said to them, I wish I would see a day where all of you will come together and fight for the cause of the Niger Delta as one. Not Ogoni land, not Ijo land, or Ishakiri or anything. One Niger Delta. But that is a problem. I think the civil society groups are doing a lot, but the problem has to do with the internal conflicts, the corruption, and the political will also in terms of the resources.
Thank you.
Hi, Zainab. Thank
Hello.
you very much for the presentation. And again, congratulations for the publication of, of the book. I'm interested if you could just give me a little bit of a flavor of, particularly in the grassroots in the community, because talking of non-violence, you really need mobilization. You need the people. You need the grassroots to be able to do that. So I would like. Can you give us a couple of examples so I could have a sense of what is it that these non-violent activities that people were doing, and what language did they use? Did they use what we talk about, non-violent, or what the language? I mean, I can tell you from my experience in Palestine that the term non-violence it's only for the elite to some extent. I mean, people use different languages describing non-violent action. So what is how is the language being used? How people describe what they're doing? And also linked to that is obviously to take a non-violent action, there is a cost, there is a price. So how people, particularly community, what price they have to pay and how do they maintain that? I mean, it is very interesting. And so thank you. You don't have to answer all of them, whatever you think.
Okay. Thank you, Marwan. So language played a very key role in the Ogoni nonviolent movement. During the time of Ken Saro-Wiwa, the Ogoni movement was designed in a way that at the community level, they had the community chapters of MOSOP, that's the umbrella organization, like I said, so they had the representation from the youth, from the women, traditional leaders, among others, even in, university lecturers, among others. So in each community, they had offices, okay? So decisions taken at the state, at the national level, maybe the Ogoni, the main organization, is passed down to the state, to each state, and then to each community. And one thing that Ken Saro-Wiwa did was that there was this mass mobilization. He did a lot of sensitization, campaigns from one community to the other. And what he did was he learned how to speak the different dialects, the different Ogoni dialects. So he didn't go maybe talking to them in English or even in the Pidgin English. Yes, there were places where he would use the Pidgin English or even formal English, but he used, he brought the issue of non-violence to the level, to the level of the community people. So he didn't really come out to say non-violence, at the community level, but he said to them, if we want, international countries and organizations to help us, to come and help us, we have to do it by not using gun or by, not carrying the sword or anything, you understand? So that is one thing he used in terms of breaking the language down to the level. And when they meet at their organizational level, they talk about non-violence. Occasionally, even the women groups, when they talk, they are aware of non-violence. And when they spoke about non-violence to me, They kept insisting, no, we don't fight with guns, we fight with virus, and we can go to offices and, you know, a company, we can go to the gate of companies and sit down and block them, you know, and hold, you know, their placards and posters saying, you know, we want our land for, among other things, or, you know, so I think language is really important. And going still, what happens in Ogoni land is that because they have different chapters at different levels, the message is passed down to, you know, to each, down to the grassroots level, but using the language is simplified and made legible to the communities. On the Ogoni, on the Ijaw side, really, it's not the same. I didn't see, you know, mass sensitization campaigns, for example. One thing I know, one major event that happened was the Kyama Declaration, when this was a representation of all the youth groups in Ijaw land, all the territories. The youth came together, they had their discussions, and they decided to expel all oil companies from their land. So language plays a very big role, and there's the use of community engagements, informal engagement, and sensitization campaigns. And then the next question you spoke about.
The cost, what people, to take violent action, it's
yes.
not something easy. You have to, there's a discipline and a price cost to do that. So, the leadership maybe talk, but those who want to do it, they are the people who mobilize, or how they manage this cost that they need to pay for such a imbalance sort of existing.
Yeah, so honestly, the costs were, they paid with their blood, they paid with their lives, both the non-violent and violent strategies that were used. Because there's this typical thing that happens in Nigeria. If a group comes out to protest, peacefully, in most cases, the police will come and they just open fire, so one strategy that the Nigerian state uses is the use of force. Just try to, quell it and crush it, immediately. But that leads to one new problem or another. So I think really they paid with their blood. I know so many women were killed during even the peaceful protests. So many women were killed, men and youth also were killed. And for those that took up arms, yes, for those that took up arms, they were met with the force of the Nigerian state. There was this thing that happened in the Niger Delta where a town called Odi was leveled to the ground by the Nigerian army. This was because some of the youths ambushed some police officers, I think, and they executed them. There were discussions in terms of releasing them. I think some payments were made, but the people were later killed, and that led to a real show of force where a whole town was leveled to the ground. Lots of women were raped, children orphaned, were left as orphans, among other things.
Okay, thank you, Zainab. But there is only one final question. We take it and then we finish. It's from Wayne. It's what is the future impact on Nigeria as the international community moves to green, low-carbon technologies over the next few decades? What will it mean for prospects in the Niger Delta?
Well, to move to that, a lot has to be done in Nigeria, because already there are issues, there are frustrations, and when you come and talk about the green economy, for example, there are some of them, the local people will not really understand. Among other things happening in the Niger Delta, there's artisanal mining and, some of these the illegal ones, among other things. So for us, for Nigeria, in terms of taking that leadership in Africa, maybe, for example, in terms of that, a lot has to be done. A lot of sensitization really has to be done across the country, both in the Niger Delta, in the Yoruba area, the northern part also. because now oil has also been discovered in the north. So it's just a matter of time before they start the exploration and another set of troubles happen. So a lot needs to be done, both at the level of, federal, state, and local level. So the government has to do a lot. Civil society organizations also have to do a lot.
Right. Thank you very much, Zainab. I think it's 2 o'clock, spot on. So I would like really to thank you very much for a very, very interesting presentation and a very interesting topic indeed. And also to the audience, all the questions, very interesting questions. And personally, you gave me more desire now to read your book. So I think someone was asking in the chat box, how can we get your book? And I think someone has answered the library has ordered some copies. Mm-hmm. So yeah, so I think people can borrow the book from the library, or they can buy it if they wish. So thank you again, Zainab. And I wish you all the best with your research. Thank you very much. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Well done.